No matter what anyone says about it, it was a wonderful era, you know.
Yeah, just clap it. Yep, go.
"17 kilometres outside of Perth, nestled into the hills of the Darling Ranges, sits the decaying remains of a remarkable structure, the Parkerville Amphitheatre, or to be accurate, the St Vincent Memorial Theatre for Australian Playwrights. The man who conceived it was John Joseph Jones. He died in 2000, ending an extraordinary 35-year love affair with this timber structure under the trees. In the 1970s, crowds of up to 6,000 revellers would come here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to start at the beginning.
It's often asked why I built the amphitheatre at all and why I stay here. And it is in its own terms a rebellious statement. It may not seem rebellious because it's so peaceful here, but it was a challenge to attitudes, crushing, almost annihilative forces that operate on people with a creative spirit that says, well, if you don't booze, surf, or if you don't frequent the beaches, if you are not a gambler, then you are not an Australian. And my attitude to that is, well, let us show you what other kinds of Australians are.
How do you compress a man of that ilk? There's so many facets. He had such an incredible creative drive. He was able to write poetry, write songs. He could compose music. He could sing really very well. He could write plays, and he had an incredible insight into the relationship of an audience to the stage and how he wanted to revolutionise that.
I decided to look for somewhere that would allow me to express my feelings about Australia in dramatic form. And I finally discovered this site in the Darling Ranges. It was the beginning of the end of a dream.
I met my husband at the bottom of the aisle in a church in Albany. I went there to sing in the choir, and there he was, came in after me and sat behind me. He had this magnificent singing voice. I couldn't sing. I was dumbfounded, and I sat and listened to him all night long.
You were a singer, though. Tell me
Yes, I actually went there because I was learning to be an opera singer. I thought all the extra music and singing would help my voice and help me to mingle and do what I have to do. So anyway, after the show, we had a cup of tea at the church, at the back of the church, and then he said, "Can I carry your books?" I thought, oh, this is funny. So he did. He escorted me home and carried my books. Then he said good night, and off he went. And I thought, that was unusual. I've never had anybody say, "Can I carry your books?" But then he was from London, so I thought, oh, perhaps they do things differently in London. One thing led to another. Next thing he's asking my mother and father, can he marry me? I'd been together 7 weeks. I thought, well, that's a bit rushed. So anyway, we got married on April 19th the following year. We lived in Cuba for about 20 years, I think it was, something like that. And then he got the itchy feet.
He was a presence known about, and already doing some wonderful things in his poetry and in his singing at the fellowship and beyond. I think he came at an interesting time when there was a renewed focus on Australian writers.
There was a very lively scene about the arts generally, but especially about theatrical things, theatres, the new theatres. And I do remember John being around then.
And he was one of those sorts of people trying to make things happen in this sleepy little town. Because, you know, at that time, and the people from the Playhouse crowd and Patch Theatre, you know, like I say, this was just part of the Perth arts scene, and everybody was desperate to try and make things happen.
It was a place and a time when people were sort of empowered. And I think that John was probably very much a product of that. I often say to people, we left UWA in the 60s thinking we could do anything. And that's the sort of thing that would have set John off.
It was a time when the whole atmosphere was beginning to move. We're beginning to shake off the sort of lethargy of the 50s, you know, where sort of it became all right to walk down the street with long dresses and flowers in your hair, and no one complained or thought it was extraordinary. So each of these people in turn, and certainly preeminent amongst them would have been John Joseph, who seemed to be he captured all, the dance and the poetry and the theatre and the way it was to be performed and the music, and he seems to capture the whole lot.
Love's opal, creation's light shines in opal's gouged...
John was writing, composing and singing at a prodigious rate of output. He had a niche music show on TV called The Folk Cellar. He had played to critical acclaim at the Adelaide Festival. By 1965, he began rehearsing his latest play, The Undivided, at the Theatre Guild in Perth.
The first play, and I guess his most famous play that he did there at the Theatre Guild, was called The Undivided. And it was set in West Berlin at the height of the Cold War, and it was about a boy and a girl who lived on each side of the Great Wall, and, you know, were in love with each other. And I can remember there was a scene between the pair on top of the wall. And there was a bit of a big sensation at the time. The play was taken up by the West Berlin authorities because, of course, it had great propaganda value. And, you know, they were saying, well, here is this poet and playwright on the other side of the world writing plays about our predicament. And it was taken up by Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of West Berlin, of course, at the time. And, you know, in a small town Perth in those days, that was a pretty big event.
Dad was involved in the rehearsals at John's place, which happened to be in Parkerville. And at some stage, the actors got sick of the author of the play interfering in the production of the play, and he wasn't the director. He was the author, and they said, "Look, John, would you please just take a hike? You know, just leave us to interpret your play how we think it should be, without your input." And he sort of got up in a huff and sort of stomped out the door. So he went for a walk down the road to the west, and 2 doors down he found this remarkable piece of land, and he said, "That's the place I've been looking for." He went in to buy the place on the spot, and he found the people that owned it had just bought it. No, mate, we've just bought the place. Yeah, we're just moving in. We're going to stay here for life. You know, you can forget that idea. So poor old Dad just went home absolutely, totally shattered. He thought, well, there was the place. It's right there. It was right there, and I can't have it. So a couple of years later, we came back just on a Sunday afternoon to visit John Tyrrell up the road. He says, "Oh, John, you know, that place you were interested in down the road there," he says, "it's actually up for sale again." And one of the only 2 times I can remember my father running anywhere, he bolted out of the chair and he ran out the door.
He said, "I'll give you some money right now." He didn't have any money. But he's that sort of man that he can sing to somebody and people love him.
He says, "Harold, I've written a cheque for $8,800 to buy this place in the hills. Will you honour the cheque? I haven't got any money." So if we want someone to blame, it's Harold Lloyd. He should have said no.
That's how the theatre started. He got the money to buy the theatre, or put a deposit on, I'm not sure quite. And then it started being built. He started doing it himself with the aid of the boys and me.
Dad had decided to build this place regardless of how we were all talking. He thought it would take 20 years. You tell me. It's an insane idea to spend 20 years building a biodegradable theatre structure in the middle of the bush, miles from anywhere on a gravel road, and for the first 3 years we didn't have electricity. But he was determined. He had a vision. You know, he was a visionary. He really did see something that was worth doing, and he would go to endless lengths to make this thing happen.
I wasn't too impressed. I didn't know enough about it because he never consulted me. It was just going to happen. So I thought, well, I'm no voice. I was no voice in the theatre whatsoever. I was a partner, but I never had any say. If I had a say, he didn't hear or didn't want to hear. So everything went his way. So I had to accept it.
Just by the nature of the way things unfolded, it wasn't really possible to run it as a professional venture with people being paid proper wages for it. So my mother had to do an awful lot of work for very little money, and we all hoped that it would pay off one day and we'd all get some of the recompense when it was sold sometime, but it didn't happen. In the meantime, she worked as the caterer, as the cleaner, as the chief cook and bottle washer. She just did an enormous amount of work. She worked very physically hard outside, cleaning things up.
Just go and look at the laterite, the granite, and that up in the hills there, and the jarrah trees and everything, and you realise what it takes to change that landscape and use a saddle, a valley saddle, for a kind of natural shape, but still takes a lot of work.
I don't remember the move, though I do remember the place where we lived until I was 5 years old, which was down in Perth. But I remember early days of the amphitheatre. He used to pay us, I think it was 5 cents a log, to get a little tomahawk and remove the bark around these marrie logs that were sort of cross-section marrie logs. We'd take off the bark, and they were used for the seating in the amphitheatre. The upright part of the seat was a jarrah sleeper from the railway line, and the part you sat on was this log, so we used to do that. I don't know that I felt lonely, but I was alone a lot. The nearest kids were several kilometres away, and so there were very few friends. There was this creek, Jane Brook, and that was a big feature of my life and still is today. And we would go around catching marron and jilgies when there used to be some. Summer days down on the creek.
It was Huckleberry Finland, and I think in many ways we really appreciated it, and we had many, many adventures. It really was something special, and I can only be grateful that we had that opportunity. I think for Mum it was a totally different story. She felt very isolated. It was very, very much back and beyond back then, and she'd been used to having close neighbours, and she suddenly found herself very isolated.
Well, I had to catch the bus first, and that had about 2 kilometres to catch the bus, and there wasn't a good bus service. And then I got my own car, and it was always breaking down, so I was always having an ROC there, so I didn't go out much, only once a week, perhaps to do shopping, and I used to go down with John. He'd go to work, and I'd come home with him, bring the groceries with me. That was my one and only outing, which was quite thrilling. was spending his money.
I think it was an imposition on her, and I always knew that, and I always felt concerned about that, actually. That bothered me, and still bothers me, that this was not her choice at all.
At the time, it was recognised he was undertaking a monumental task, making a theatre. You can see it's an expression of frustration, in a way, as well as fulfilment.
As it took shape, John named his theatre after a man he deeply admired, Senator Seddon Vincent, who had died in 1964. Vincent had been a champion for the arts and fought for increased Australian content across theatre, film and radio.
There was a renewed focus on Australian writers and the need to give them space, airspace, especially with the new media TV. Clearly, John Joseph Jones, he was deeply embroiled in all that, in that fight. And it's interesting that his amphitheatre is dedicated to Seddon.
It was sort of in the air. It was doing things that were in non-traditional venues, that were exploratory. It was almost the time the word innovative sort of hit the deck as far as hey, this is a good thing. This is an innovating project, we might be interested in it. Somewhere about that time, I remember going up to the hills to Parkerville. I found myself at this magical place. Absolutely, look, what a wonderful place for a kid's picnic, you know, and they were still being built, you know. And I can remember Brian, my husband, was at the time president of the Musicians' Union, and Harry Bluck, who was the professional secretary of the union, was clearly involved in some to-do with this Parkerville thing. He'd taken it under his wing a bit.
Harry had seen an article that was written in the Women's Weekly. It was about this mad idea for a theatre in the middle of nowhere. And Harry showed the article to his friend Colin Campbell, who was the comptroller of prisons, a compassionate man who wanted to rehabilitate the prisoners. He didn't want them just to sit around chopping wood and breaking rocks. So if I could find an outlet for them to get out of the jail and rehabilitate, they should connect with the people again and just get them a halfway sort of thing. And Harry showed this to Colin and said, would this make a good project for you? It's labour intensive, there's all sorts of different trades involved. And Colin said, yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. There'll be a lot of them will be unskilled, and a great many of them will be Aboriginal prisoners who've quite possibly never had a job in their lives.
Because his idea achieved momentum and got going and people began to sit up and take notice, he did get that help of the prisoners with the understanding of Campbell, the prison director at the time, who was a pretty enlightened man and saw the link between the arts and rehabilitation for prisoners.
How did you feel about having prisoners?
Hated it. Absolutely hated. I was the only woman with all these men around the place, so I kept inside as much as I could. But it was quite interesting, you know, to hear these little tales that the prisoners used to say about it, and they just wanted to get out every day to come up there because they were free.
Well, the next day a truck arrived and 20-odd men were on it, and the next day they came back again. And they came back for the best part of 20 months. Sometimes they were accompanied by 2 prison officers and sometimes by 1. And they allowed me to introduce the ideas of the construction to the men and to supervise the skilled area of work involved. 2 of the very fine officers who worked here went far beyond their own bounds of duty in helping the men, showing them what to do, and in doing the work actually themselves. In short, giving the men a lead out and not attempting to sever themselves from the fact that the men were prisoners. Of course, this was my own approach. Log in with the men, carry their stone, mix their cement, help them dig the holes, put the poles in. We treated them always as dignified human beings. They were never prisoners. I think I was more a prisoner of this project, and am still, than they ever were. We would sit down and talk about the theatre and what it meant. And I would say that the landscape is very precious here. I want you to guard it and to treasure it. And they would usually smile at me and say, Well, boss, we know all about that. Use the fellows who don't know anything about it. To work with the Aboriginal people was in itself an artistic experience. I was constantly being taught by them. I feel that, as a reflection, one must, with the Aboriginal people, be prepared to be the pupil rather than their tutor, if anything creative is to happen.
I used to try and go and see them when I got home from school if they were still there, or if they weren't there, I'd go around and I'd have a look at what they've been doing. It was a great thing for me. I was this big, you know.
For 2 years, more than 100 men from prisons around the state came to the site, working with John to build a towering timber structure.
And those chaps did an enormous amount of work. Incredibly difficult work, very, very hard. The ground was incredibly hard to dig. It was like rock in the summer, and it was like glue in the winter.
Sweat and tears, and well, it wasn't easy. And yet I loved doing it. And I thought, well, that was good. I enjoyed seeing it grow and see it come into some beautiful shape, you know.
People in this neck of the woods didn't see people who weren't white. So in those days, it was an unusual thing. Probably set him apart. I don't know if that made him enemies or not.
So Dad was offered the use of this space next to his place, and we'll make a car park out of it. And the next door neighbour said, you can have my bit as well. So we had a space that could accommodate 200 cars, which is an absolute gift. So he set about getting a contractor to level the site, and he was up there supervising one day, and the Deputy Shire Clerk happened to drive past in the works ute, and he slowed down, and I don't know how to put this, expletive and deleted. You'll never get those effing black seas back here again. And what he was referring to was the use of public money through the prisons department being used on a private project. And Dad was nonplussed at this, and the ute sped off, and those two individuals did not talk again for at least 20 years. And that was, eventually it was a really big part of the downfall of the place, was that encounter. The label was withdrawn by the prisons department because of the outcry from several members of the public. Said, why are you using public funds to fund this particularly outrageous concept in the bush? You know, what a waste of money. And without any regard to the human input and the human benefit that was being reaped by this small amount of money that was being spent. People's lives were being changed. You know, hugely wonderful things were being created. The public would have been served by the use of the theatre and after it was finished. So the Aboriginal element of this was a very big part of it.
Men in prison for petty crimes, working in an environment in which they could create something, in which they could recreate themselves as people, in which they could remain inherently decent and good men. Some of the men, when they left me, cried bitterly. I can remember a 6'4" giant sitting under the bridge by the stonework that he laid, crying as though he was a child hurt. When I asked him why he was crying, he said, I haven't finished yet, and I don't want to go until I have.
They were probably 3 months short of finishing it after 18 months of work. And he had to default on all sorts of payments because he just couldn't pay for the things that he'd got. And in the process, he went nearly broke, and he was put under Section 10 of the Bankruptcy Act. In order for the place to exist at all, it first he ran on his overdraft.
With the amphitheatre still a few months from completion, a surplus of construction materials and mounting debts, John was determined to finish by any means possible and open for business.
I had a phone call from John Joseph, who told me that he had this venture underway and he was building this amphitheatre, and would I care to go out and see it? And I saw this, a tremendous amphitheatre, absolutely monumental. And it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, the landscaping, the trees, and I could just imagine the drama that we could create there. But it seemed to me at the time that John Joseph was very obsessed by this, and he seemed to be doing the whole thing himself. I mean, I'm sure he had other helpers at various times, but it seemed to me as if it was like one man in ancient Egypt trying to build a pyramid on his own.
The intention of the amphitheatre ripples outwards. It is too powerful, it's too organic, and it is too continuous. It has touched too many people for it ever to be stopped. It is, in short, a song that has reached now many people and will continue to reach many people, because it is in reality a song of Australia.
I'm Patsy Millett, the eldest daughter of the writer Mary Durack Miller. My mother's association with the arts and culture in Perth went right back to the 1950s, and she also was one of the people who became involved with John Joseph Jones. I think she thought he was a nice young man, and she was always very keen to help people with bright ideas. I noticed when reading my mother's diaries that when she mentions John Joseph Jones here, as she did almost every day, with yet another one of his bright projects, among them were an opera or operas, plays, a ballet, ballads, pop songs, evocations, TV scripts, children's songs, songs for Aborigines, a song book, articles, rhapsodies, psalms, hymns, and songs that suited the event of the moment.
It was the same for all of us, but there's this slightly insane look when you realise that you are at the absolute end of the earth. As far as the arts are concerned, you know, we've got to get something happening because, you know, you've got to travel 2,000 miles before you actually start going anywhere. Nothing ever came over.
John Jones rang Mum and said that he had heard that she had agreed to support a group of Maunjum dancers coming down to Perth for the Perth Festival. Now, this was the first my mother had ever heard of that. She was very surprised, and it was the last thing she needed at the time. And she rang the Department of then Native Affairs the next day and said, what was this about? And they said, oh, well, we spoke to John Joseph Jones yesterday, and he suggested that we actually bring down some dancers for the festival, and that you would be willing to actually support this venture.
You know, it's when people were trying to get the Festival of Perth up and running and so forth, there was this general air of desperation. You know, and he was just part of that. He was part of that group of people who were trying to make something happen, you know.
It was John who thought that one up, and then, of course, immediately suggested that that his then still being constructed Parkerville Amphitheatre would be a suitable venue for the opening of the Maunjum dances. It was one of the first performances put on as part of the Aboriginal Theatre Foundation, of which my mother was a founding member, and it was tremendously important to my mother that it went well because they required a report to see if this was a success, in which case she would have found it much easier to put on other performances that involved Aboriginal players.
That was a really historic thing for an Aboriginal dance troupe to come down with some really splendid dances, really based on the tradition. The Maunjum people had come from the north coast, Wurrura people, and Warrnambool, and they brought a real energy to their dancing, and they developed in Derby, and here was John Joseph Jones developing in Perth, and they come together at the amphitheatre, and it's a perfect setting for a corroboree-style performance.
It was spectacular. The dancers' costumes were tremendous. We had a very good professional narrator of the stories between the dancers, and the dancers acquitted themselves, I would say, from first to last, much better than a number of the white participants.
That was the most important and rewarding thing for all of us. They were so well mannered, and they stayed right. Once they'd had a meal, out they went over the other bank, and they'd play instruments, their instruments, and sing. It's like having more concerts all through the day as well as the evening. It was exciting. Then after the show, which would be about 12 o'clock, I suppose, we'd be invited to sit around the fire on the stage, and the women taught me how to do the dance. And it looks simple, but don't believe me, it's not. So it's quite an honour for us to be there at that time.
The report does cover it very kindly, very diplomatically. The report is diplomatic. It had to be because my mother was very anxious to get the Aboriginal Theatre Foundation off the ground and running, and so she wanted this to be a success. And she glossed over many of the difficulties that went on. She made as the best she could of them.
I don't know what it was about. I really don't. But it might have had something to do with control of the event, that sort of thing, and who was in charge.
John is too pushy. He's pompous. He is incorrigible. He is an incorrigible, eager beaver. As much as I would like to help him and be interested, goodness, not every day. Do you want me to read that? Because that really sort of sums it up.
I think he had a very high-spirited sort of character, and probably rubbed people up the wrong way at times, or he cut corners. And I was on the main chance and the long game, so he could run up a debt, I suppose, just getting the thing done.
After that, my mother ceased to sponsor John Jones, or in fact to answer phone calls from him if he rang, and a very rare case of where my mother actually drew the line and cut somebody off.
Finding himself decidedly out of favour, and with rising debts, John's project forged ahead, subsisting mainly on his overdraft. To make ends meet, he worked as an English literature professor at Leederville Technical College.
John was my mentor. He was a very erudite, very knowledgeable, very, he had such a good grasp on so many things of life, in life in general.
He was a very intelligent man, and he had very high standards. But he was a rather large individual and very formidable. And I remember he started off by singing to us. He had this wonderful tenor voice that he projected very well, and so that was my introduction to John Joseph Jones.
By a forge near a hut on the Condamine River, a blacksmith laboured at his ancient trade.
He was almost like a Pied Piper of Hamelin, like people gravitated to him. I think John used to use the Leederville Technical College as a recruitment camp for some of his parts.
He sang a song for a job well done, and the song and the clamour of his busy hammer They merged and mingled in a tempered tone.
You know, he really didn't prepare us for the grandeur of it all. There's no reference point for it.
It was almost like for a child to go to a holiday camp. There was so much of interest there, the buildings, seating, the walkways, they'd all sort of been carved out of the landscape, so much jarrah around the place. Everything was jarrah. It was, I'd never seen anything like that before, even though I'd travelled extensively at that time. I'd never seen anything like this.
We began to appreciate the work put into it, and he gave us a history about how the Aboriginals, the prisoners, were employed as, laborers, and how they helped put the theatre together. But he was the main designer and engineer of it. We all participated at one point or another in either maintaining it or helping construct parts of the theatre. Before one play, we had to make the Jane Brook deeper because it involved a boat scene. And I was one out of a crew of 5, and we had to build a dam underneath one of the bridges so we could increase the depth. Yes. But he was very good at motivating people, and he was very inspirational. And you wanted to be involved. You did.
Derry would say he's down on the bottom fence on the other side and he's fixing the fence, so I'd go down there, and the next thing John said, oh, can you pass this, can you pass this, can you hold this, can you hold this? So it was a sort of like an outward bound camp.
Midsummer Night's Dream was my first production, and it was probably one of the most successful plays, at least in the 70s. We had very good crowds. I think that was the first play where the core group of people that I was associated with got together, and that cohesion continued throughout other productions as well.
Sturt was about another dreamer like my dad, an early explorer in Australia, who thought there must be an inland sea because the rivers of the, is it called the Great Dividing Range in New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria? And one set of rivers runs to the sea, and on the other side the rivers run inland, and nobody knew where they came out. So they figured there must be an inland sea, but of course they didn't realise there was an exit. A bit like Don Quixote, like wasn't there.
Sturt was John's most ambitious production to date. It allowed him to showcase his theatre's many unique stages and vantage points, and to begin to realise the potential of the space.
This amphitheatre has 3 semicircular stages. The first of these is in the foreground here. It's a grassed area with a wooden podium, and we're using it on this occasion for the garden party scene at the home of Sir Ralph Darling, the Governor of New South Wales. Across the water, which is also used as a stage for the river scenes of the play, is the desert stage. On this stage, we reenact the explorations of the desert areas of Australia with Captain Sir Charles Sturt. To my left and above the water is a wooden stage, again a large semicircle, on which we are reenacting the flogging scenes at Norfolk Island.
My part of the play was to flog the prisoners, a non-speaking part, because I was very shy. They were flogged up there and walked around with my brother having applied the tomato sauce with stripes of fingers going through it from the salt bucket. And the prisoners walked out, and people walked, as they walked, they had their backs to the audience, and several people fainted because it looked so real. And this was entirely what he was about.
The great flexibility of movement, which is possible between stage and stage by means of bridges, allows us the use of a cinematic technique in the live theatre. By this means, we have a great rapidity of scene change by merely raising and lowering lights.
For most of us, we started to grasp Australia in cultural terms, more so from his work and from the way he was presenting it than perhaps anybody else.
I had a smaller role in that play where I was in a boat with a number of other individuals, and we had Aboriginals throwing spears at us. And there was no talk of safety. So we endured this for 6 productions, and unfortunately nobody ever got hurt.
Did you get close?
Oh yes, they got close. They were hitting the boat with the spears, and we're lying flat in the boat. In those days, we were young and hey, let's go for it,
The Aboriginal men who performed in the play were prisoners from one of the open prisons in this state. Some of these men actually helped to build the theatre 18 months beforehand. It was quite an odd quirk of fate that on the opening performance, when their party left the stage, to the words of "You go to the east and we to the west" from Sturt himself, 3 members of the Aboriginal contingent took it to heart and kept on going. They were found later about 1,200 miles away, up towards Port Hedland.
Now, all the shows that were on there, I never saw them right through. I used to help get them teas and things ready for intervals, the food and everything, look after the stove and things like that. So I never actually sat down in the audience and watched it through. So I only got a bit of this and a bit of that, you know.
Nice lady. She knew she was married to a nutter. I mean, I don't quote me, but I mean, you know, he was so committed to what he did. And he was genuinely committed. He wasn't a charlatan at all.
With a succession of productions and a loyal band of collaborators, John's dream of an independent theatre in the bush was on track. But storm clouds were gathering over Parkerville as council sought avenues to close the theatre down.
John Joseph wrote a play, was it Sour Grapes? We were, bitter grapes, that was set in the Swan Valley, and it was about the wine industry and the Italian characters and so on.
First of all, he gave me the script, and the first thing I did was cut about a third of it. He was outraged. I said, "But you already said that on page 3. Out goes page 76, you know. I remember him being quite outraged.
Transposed this scenario to his own life, really, where he felt like he was being squeezed out by the actions of the local Shire Council, and what he believed was a wonderful creative vision was being thwarted by bureaucracy. So it became a kind of metaphor for what his own situation was, and the Shire Council in the play sort of creates problems for the vineyard, and the vineyard sort of can't function anymore.
Have you been a man before your own time, then?
No, I don't think so. I think this is an excuse which has been used by the people who don't want this amphitheatre to succeed. A man, an artist, lives in his own time. He can only create in his own time. There is a great need for the amphitheatre. There is a great love for it amongst the common people of this state and of other states. But there is a great hatred and a great jealousy in the corridors of power, which in effect the Premier's mind of this state. He has never bothered to come here and see for himself. I doubt if he has even picked the application that I made up off the table and read it.
I don't know what his troubles with the council were, but I was for John.
It was just starting to really hit its straps as a venue. Original plays were being done, there was a lot of work coming in. It still wasn't making any money, and it was becoming more and more difficult to pay the mortgage.
Creditors should have at least given us another 12 months, because the situation with the finances that are around Perth are very bad at the moment, and I'm sure they could have seen that we are not the only ones who are affected by this.
I'm quite sure that if the amphitheatre was given the opportunity to operate without being sued by the creditors, that the forthcoming 12 months would show a good return to the existing creditors and to pay out the running debts.
This had a bad effect on us, I think, because as children we were constantly hearing that the bank was going to foreclose next Thursday, kind of thing. That was a recurring refrain. And I think that caused a bit of uncertainty, and to this day I have a phobia of mortgages. I do not want one. I don't think I will ever have one, and I think that's why.
Wouldn't it have been fantastic if John Joseph Jones had managed to have his hand out at the right moment for a whole pile of money to fall into it and say, "Don't worry about it, we'll get it all fixed up, and yes, the idea of a little intimate theatre will happen."
Creative people is a fair way to describe us, and then you have to deal with bureaucracy and run a business, and that's hard. You know, that's kind of, oh dear, here we go. So I think that's a big stress, and that limits what happens. And Dad tackled it and put himself into it, but I'm sure if he hadn't had to deal with that, he would have achieved more and would have been much happier about what he'd done.
He doesn't really get the go. He doesn't get the money, he doesn't get the encouragement. He battles on, and by sheer strength of character, he makes it work. But Pace is really probably takes too much out of him.
Under a lot of duress, Dad put it on the market to sell it. And he asked an enormous amount of money for it because he didn't really want to sell it. And he was asking $800,000, which in 1972 was an absolute fortune. But it was probably what it was worth, but it was a lot of money. He had some interest from some Japanese people who came to visit and said, we want to buy this place. He put such strict conditions on the purchase that were untenable. He said, I want the money here in Perth within 2 days, I think it was. I'm not sure about all the details. He gave him a very, very short time to get money. And this is a long time ago. There wasn't internet. These things took time, and he didn't give them the time. And eventually they withdrew the offer because they said, we can't fulfil your demands, which was really what he wanted to happen. He didn't want them to buy it. He didn't want to sell it anyway. So it sort of staggered along for many, many years afterwards, and life would have been very different if it had been sold at that time.
What might have been your mum's reaction to that?
I wouldn't be stretching the truth to say it was despair. Because she was, like, if there's a slogan that describes this, and we're being brutally honest here, it was my dad's dream and it was my mother's nightmare.
At the time, I was working at the old Civic Theatre in Inglewood when it accommodated a theatre restaurant called Diamond Lil's Wild West Saloon, and I was playing Cecil the Sexy Sheriff of Sherbet City. Anyway, one of the cast asked me if I would go with him for morning tea at the home of John Joseph Jones. I accepted the invitation, and somehow I found myself washing up Mr. Jones's breakfast dishes. I can still see me now. I was standing at the kitchen sink there, and Mr. Jones was over on my right, yet to pick up a tea towel, as I remember, and he was mulling and musing as to what sorts of shows he should put on in his amphitheatre to make a bit of money. And at the time, outdoor rock and roll shows were still a bit of a novelty, and, well, I don't know, my head must have been full of Woodstock, because I said, why not put on a rock and roll show? Well, his little face lit up. It lit up in such a way as to make me realise that nobody had made that suggestion to him before. So all these years later, I am claiming credit for those rock and roll shows, but none of the blame for the despicable audience behaviour.
I approached him with this idea to put on concerts there, and the possibility was of making some money, whereas amateur dramatics really doesn't make money. So they wanted to do it as a promotional thing, so they didn't pay a lot of money for using the venue, but they certainly got a huge crowd, and it put us on the map.
People everywhere, people in the pool, up the trees, they were on the roofs, they were in the water, they were on the fence, they were jumping over the fence, trying to get in without paying.
Yeah, there was some wonderful local talent, as for instance like the Bakery Review. On top of that, there were the Eastern States visitors, among them Johnny Farnham. Very, very early days for him. Johnny Farnham was top of the pops. He only had one hit record out at that stage. It was Sadie the Cleaning Lady. I remember him getting changed in the house which my parents lived on this block just adjacent to the theatre, and he was getting changed in there, and he met my sister, who was all of 5 years old. He picked her up and kissed her, and she just had stars in her eyes. She didn't wash her face for 5 days. He ran the gauntlet, and race up to the stage where all the teeny boppers run after him. He played his show and went down a treat, and he had to run back through all the crowd again, got back into the house. And we were besieged. There were people all around the house trying to get inside, and I said, well, how's he going to get out? He's got to go somewhere else and sing tonight. So Dad told me, go around to the back door and tell him that he's coming out the front. So I told all the gathered multitude at the back, and they went around the front. Meanwhile, Johnny and his manager ran out the back door and ran across the paddock, and it's a scene I'll never forget. They ran across the paddock, leapt over the post and rail fence, hopped into their Austin Healey Sprite, and only to find that some clowns had taken they'd let the air out of the back tyres. So when the kids realised, they ran after him like a Pied Piper, and the car sort of sachets up to the gravel road and sort of spins down the road with all the kids in pursuit.
I'm fairly confident that that's not the kind of music that John Joseph would have appreciated, but it's my understanding that he was able to use the situation of the rock concerts up there to keep the venture afloat.
I remember that Parkerville was up in the hills, and in Perth those days you only ever travelled 10 kilometres anywhere from the beach to home or to the other beach. So this was like going to the country. You had to go through this very narrow dirt track. That's all it was, and we could only afford cheap cars, and they'd overboil. So there was always someone breaking down, and you'd see the bonnet up and water going in, or someone would get bogged because they tried to get around.
We drove off Great Eastern Highway into Parkerville. We'd not been there before, so we didn't really know what to expect. There was lots of people, cars parked the entire way down, and we had some worries about how we were going to get our gear set up.
I was driving there to see Bakery play in a show. It was very exciting because you didn't have many opportunities to see rock bands at all, and it was a really, once you got there, it was a really interesting setup. Could be a bit hot in the day, but the sound was great.
That's me there, playing a Gibson 345 stereo, which I'm still kicking myself for getting rid of.
Well, I don't remember it in chronologically very well. I think I played three shows there, and so they get jumbled up in my mind a little bit. It's probably a bit like Woodstock. If you remember it, you weren't there. It was a great event because we didn't have anything in those days. There were no real festivals like we have all over the place now. So it was Perth's really first rock festival.
Parkerville was like the oxygen mask of music for musicians and people within that music community, that we had something where we could hear the kind of music that we liked. Perth was really homogenous, and so there was kind of a crew of people who I guess there was maybe 500 or 1,000 people in Perth overall who were into what we would call hip, groovy, underground music. After 6 months of going to these venues, you'd know by sight about 60% of the people who were there. So these were people generally in those days, they had long hair, wore jeans, rolled their own cigarettes.
They were great events, and it was very special to those of us that were there and performed there. So I have great memories of it, people jumping in, fully clothed and maybe not so fully clothed, and
Most of the gigs I can remember doing up there were with Western Flyer. I don't know if it's the same for other musicians, but basically all I ever saw in the audience was the girls. And I was the drummer, you see, so I could just sit there watching.
You did feel like you were very hip and in California or San Francisco or somewhere watching these bands play, and once the sun started to go down, it was a really beautiful atmosphere because the sun would come on the water. You sit on one bank and look up at the stage, and the bands would play, and it was an amphitheatre, so it was a really great sound, much better sound than you ever got in a pub or even in a concert hall. It was really terrific.
Clearly that environment probably sort of had an effect on the audience to the extent that they were really loose, you know, they were really, it was just like Woodstock for our mini Woodstock, you know, in WA.
Well, 6,000 people turned up and capacity was really 3,000. And this event was such an extraordinary thing to happen. However, it probably, in the end, it kind of cooled the pitch for us.
Yeah, there was controversy, and it was well known that there was you know, sort of a reaction to the fact, you know, destroying the peaks of the hills and all that sort of thing, and so everyone was aware of that, I think, and there was a little bit of politics going on, a bit unfairly, I think, because I mean the amphitheatre only operated infrequently, and it was just, you know, weekends and stuff like that, and not late into the night or anything, but you know, it was understood that there was, you know, some problem about it. Yeah.
As the amphitheatre's popularity grew from strength to strength among young, hip music fans, an increasingly agitated local council found itself besieged with complaints from locals, outraged with the traffic, noise, and the apparently lewd and loose behaviour. The Joneses began to feel the heat.
Rock concerts there might have been very appealing at the time, but to my mind didn't suit that particular venue. Too loud, too noisy, too big, too much hassle. And by that time, sure as eggs, not only the Shire Council, I guess, but the neighbours must have been getting a bit touchy about things.
Oh, that was terrible, yes. But we were able to invite some of them in, and they often used to like to come in. Those were all for it. But the other neighbours, no. Because they weren't there, they didn't know what was going on. They presumed they knew what was going on. And one starts saying, oh, this is happening down there, because you know how it is. They talk to each other, and then that person talks to someone else. It's never the real story. So they didn't know what was actually going on. I'd go down to the store and I'd have to stand in queue, and then someone come in and stand in front of me, so that I was always at the back of the queue. And it was so rude, absolutely rude. Now, people don't have to be rude like that, just because they didn't like the music. I mean, the kids had to have their music.
I felt at the time that was going off the path by John. And as I've said, I think his contribution is of a different order altogether.
You could really sense his frustration, I think. My impression is that he was a guy who put a lot of work into something and was frustrated at how hard it was to get
a return for the work that he'd done, and I mean that on a whole lot of different levels. I don't think that he really wanted us there. I'm not, look, please don't misunderstand. I'm certainly not saying that he was, either an ogre or that he was rude or anything like that. But you always sense that we were there because we were a way out. Everything was idiosyncratic. The sort of the dressing room was this hut, on the other side of a lake, and people sort of all around, and bridges going from one place to another, and people jumping into the water and all of that. And obviously it was a summer venue, so there was a lot of insect sounds around and the sounds of the bush.
We used to have fireworks go off when they'd start their show each time in the middle of summer. Totally OHS irresponsible.
One particular performance of mine, there was a guy that was getting into pyrotechnics. He'd never done it before, and he decided he would experiment on me, basically, and he had a lineup of explosives on the front of the stage, and at the start of one of my songs he let these off at the most dramatic moment, and I got singed hair and got thrown back. The whole band was sort of blasted back. So that was an interest. Certainly that stuck in my memory.
Sparks flew more than once that day, with a lineup that featured soon-to-be legends of Australian rock, Cold Chisel.
They came to play, and it was an extraordinary concert. It was one of the best ones we ever had as far as what happened. It was just beautiful. They just were in top form that night, and particular highlight for me was Ian Moss singing Georgia. And that was one of the most beautiful things that ever happened. It was him singing that song, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place. It was just one of those magic moments that you live for in entertainment business. You hope things like that happen. This is one of them. Anyway, they did a great show, but we lost 1,500. We had 1,500 people there, but we needed 2,000 people to break even because of the expenses. So we lost quite a large amount of money that night. And nowadays, you can't believe that it could have happened, but it did. Because they just weren't known. People just didn't know who they were. So a week later, everyone knew they were. They were famous forever after. But we caught them just before they crested the wave.
I first heard of Parkerville, that there were some big shows there, and that they'd been going quite a while before I actually got to Perth. There were some great gigs in Perth at that time, but not many really good outdoor ones. So, and it had quite a reputation too. People really enjoyed going there.
Matt Taylor was the second last act on, and it just got dark. He'd sung 2 songs and the power went off. And so there's no electricity, no lights, no sound, everything had gone. We didn't know why.
Someone said, Matt, just do something.
You've got 2,000 punters sitting in the dark, and they're sitting there all day drinking beer and whatever. And it was the potential for an absolute catastrophe. And to his eternal credit, Matt Taylor got up and went down onto the dance floor in the midst of the people instead of being up on the relatively distant stage above the water. He went down and stood among the people. We got a bunch of candles to put around him, and he sang his heart out for about 3/4 of an hour.
People realised that, it was something special, so they were really quiet. And being an amphitheatre, you could probably hear me, because I'm not a soft little singer.
He virtually stopped the riot that could have happened.
The first time I remember playing was probably 76 or 77, and the last time would have been probably late 78 in the Roosters. I reckon I played there about 6 to 8 times. It was a bit of a drunkard's paradise, and I think that's why people came, as a rule, to enjoy rock and roll and have a day out in the bush and get drunk and eat and probably smoke pot, which was about the worst thing you could do in those days, or the most severe thing you could do.
There's a photo of me in my white suit playing, so I reckon that must have been around 1977, early days with the suburbs, as kind of really breaking it in Perth. And it was really good fun for us because we had played in pubs and smaller venues, like really divey kind of venues where you're stuck to the floor.
Sort of needed to find somewhere where we could maybe hope for 3,000 people that was set up for bands, but was enclosed and had all of those services basically available. And Parkerville sort of came up.
Thought we might get a big crowd, make some money, and so we went for it.
And if you looked at that lineup, you would have said, this is the sort of show, all other things being equal, should pull that crowd. And it didn't. We didn't do our shirts, but...
There was sort of pelting rain the day before, I think absolutely poured with rain, and there were forecasts of rain. And in those days, there was no idea of pre-selling tickets. You simply sold the tickets at the time. So we were really worried, were we going to lose a lot of money to... which would have been a drag, of course. But as it turned out, it was a reasonably fine day. But I think in Perth in those days, people made their decision by midnight the night before, so it did affect the crowd a bit.
I remember waking up and throwing the curtains open in the house I was living in Netherlands, and it was just sparkling and perfect, and I almost sort of could see myself standing in the window rubbing my hands together and going, Dave, this is the day we clean up big.
In the end, we came out about even. I don't think we made any money from it, but we didn't lose. We didn't lose too much. There were, I think, a few ropes with old tyres hanging on them, and so a few hoons would, throughout the course of the performance, sort of leap on and grab these. Now, they're only supposed to kind of swing from the bank, I think, but unfortunately you did get some people who tried to leap from high parts of the stage or something with disastrous consequences.
Could you get your mongrel off the stage, please? Can you not dive down near the PA there, down near the desk? Just splashing it. We all might go kaput. Blow shit out of everyone.
At that show, there were 2 members of the audience who decided they were going to dive into the pool, and both of them were quite badly hurt.
There wasn't much water in the pool that day, and they'd all broken their necks.
Almost within, I'm going to say, it feels like it was within half an hour of each other. I mean, it may not have been, maybe a couple of hours, but it was in that. So all of a sudden, in the band hut up at the back, we had people, in there who were badly injured. I mean, with neck, spinal injuries and needing to be taken away.
There were signs around, as far as I can recall, but you're young and think you're indestructible and don't see the signs or whatever, or get carried away by the music. So that aspect of it is really tragic and something that it's extremely disappointing.
That wasn't a particularly good sort of psychological background for us to consider whether we were going to keep doing shows up there.
Already reeling from the horror of this event, more trouble was just around the corner.
I really thought it was a huge star back in the 60s and early 70s, and it was a huge event, and it was really something big deal at the time. A week before the concert, we got a call from his manager saying that he'd been offered a tour of America, which he wanted to do all his life, and he had to be there that next weekend, so he couldn't come to Perth.
He cancelled out for some reason, and Western Flyer took over the headlining of the show.
3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the concert's just started, and I'm walking up to the ticket box to collect some money, and I saw that this bikies continued. So I walked through, and they started pushing people over and bashing people. I thought, what on earth is happening here? I found out they hadn't paid to get in, they just walked through. Turned out there were 19 bikies, and they just continued to wreak mayhem all through the day and night. Eventually the police turned up. There were equal numbers of police and bikies. The bikies got up on top of a platform that we built for a play and said, well, come and get us. And the cops couldn't do anything about it. They said, well, it's your problem, it's not our problem. You have to sort it out. So they left. left us with these people who've been causing mayhem all day.
I'd come from Queensland where the police are really quite heavy, you wouldn't even go and talk to a policeman, not in 1966 in Brisbane, because they just say, what's your name, give you a hard time. In fact, I can remember first going to Melbourne, and I got lost, and I thought, oh God, I'm going to have to ask a policeman. And I said, excuse me, officer, can you tell me where Swanson Street is? And he said, certainly, sir. You walk, and after sir, I didn't hear another word. I was in shock. So here we are at the Parkerville Theatre, and these guys just abusing the police, and I thought, oh God, if that was up in Brisbane, they'd all be smashed.
I know the subsequent consequences of that was that Dad found it extremely difficult to get insurance for the amphitheatre to run productions there, run shows there, events. It really made things difficult.
The writing was on the wall. No longer able to insure themselves properly, after almost a decade in operation, the combination of negative publicity, local hostility, and council bureaucracy signalled a turning point for the amphitheatre and for the Joneses.
By about 78 or 80, it's no longer happening. Too many changes. Yeah, and enormous changes, both happening in music and happening in politics. And while you had the Vietnam War, it really, people of an alternative were really close together. But once all of that started to dissipate, everyone went their own way, and other forces came in to dominate, and it's unfortunate that great experiments like Parkerville went with it.
It got even worse as John clashed with the Shire over issues of public liability within the outlying area of their property used for car parking. Legal wrangles stretched out from months to years as the theatre was reduced to a shadow of its former self.
It just went on and on and on for decades.
Through the 1980s and 90s, as his debt inexorably mounted, John maintained an unwavering faith, and the theatre continued to play host to events from weddings to children's camps, and even a brief but glorious run of the West Australian Symphony Orchestra, offering tantalising glimmers of hope. But the amphitheatre never reclaimed its place as an icon of Perth's cultural scene.
Dad had taken a reverse mortgage to tide himself over when he retired from work, thinking that we'll get the car park back, we'll get it working again, and we'll sell it. That was the object of taking the mortgage, but rather than get it foreclosed on. We beseeched him for all that time, just find a way to solve this problem, get whatever agreement you can get, and just sell the place. And he thought, hoped against hope that he would get it the way he wanted, and he didn't. And in the end, it was utter despair. He died 2 days before the total amount had to be repaid. I was executor of the will. My mother lived on the premises, and we had to find $290,000 in 2 days from now. And it was just not possible.
It was tragic that it was so attacked and knocked and undermined so much for such a long, consistently, So, that is a tragic aspect to this story. That's something so wonderful. I mean, it was a wonderful place, and he did wonderful things with it as best he could. And people, you can find lots of people who say, "Oh, I went there. Oh, yeah. Oh, that was the amphitheatre. Oh, yeah, I went there and did it. We saw this and we did this. Oh, yeah." And their faces light up and their voices go, and you can tell how much it meant to so many people. Thousands and thousands of people had a great time there, and it was such an asset. And it could have been such a better asset, and it could have been utilised so much more and have been of so much more benefit to the community if attitudes had been different.
I would imagine council just saw it as a nuisance and as something that didn't enhance it. So I think, you know, like they didn't see the value that that other people did, and I just think these days it would be a vastly different situation.
I mean, it's interesting to think of the Shire of Mundaring now have got one of the best arts organisations in the state, and are very proud of it. Perhaps John contributed to somehow or other letting there be an arts organisation. It's a different one, it's a visual arts one, but they've actually been committed to it. It's over 20 years old now, and they see it as an asset. So perhaps that's a little legacy of John's.
So we eventually sold it for virtually what it was owed on it. I didn't get any of my unpaid super, my unpaid sick leave over 30 years employment. I never had a sick day in my life. I never had a paid holiday. My mother, who lived on the premises, had nothing. She didn't get another house to live in. My siblings got no inheritance, and we sold it for like half what it was worth. And there was probably $300,000 or $400,000 that should have been split up between us, and it never eventuated.
When I closed that front door of my house, I didn't look back. Because all it was a lot of worry and a lot of it work. Well, I'd lived a long lifetime there, you know, and it wears you down.
Perth has always been slow recognising people, and if you don't belong to an inner sort of, shall we say, academic background, you know, and some of the ones who were so-called academics who are running all the various enterprises like puppets or children's theatre, the Playhouse, or the ballet, each of them in turn went through vast sums of money, and there's very little to show for it. And other people, meanwhile, were working, you know, on an oil rig and producing things that had real value. And we just didn't get a chance to appreciate it because the media just didn't pick up on them. So, yeah, it was cursory, but not the way it should have been.
A lot of John Joseph Jones' work has been overshadowed a bit and left behind by the march of time.
Like a lot of artists and writers, he had this obsession, he was passionate about it, and of course at the end of the day, I suppose one must wonder if he didn't take on this massive project of building his amphitheatre, how many more plays he might have written.
I liked Don, got on well with him. But he was in a bit in cloud cuckoo land if he thought that he was suddenly going to build a successful theatre in the hills. I mean, people won't go into the Playhouse. Don't come up here. No, I mean, he was a bit unreal in that sense. But he was committed, and he was an honest man, an honest rogue, I think.
One of the things that we sadly lack these days is visionaries. People who have got the dream of trying to do something. We're much more concentrated on people saying, oh, the insurance risk is very high, or, oh, we couldn't possibly afford that now, or, goodness, that would cost a lot. But the vision is a much more attractive thing to think about. From everyone's point of view, from ours, from histories. You know, not doing things is very boring.
You couldn't recreate that, really. And it was, it was some of the favourite times of my life, I suppose.
It was a joy to be there, and those people that were privileged to be there, they remember it with enormous affection. So in answer to the question, did he achieve his aim? I'd say yeah, he did. At great personal cost and enormous cost to his own family. And you can weigh it all up in the balance. Was it really worth it? I don't know. We had an absolutely extraordinary life. It doesn't relate to the everyday. We lived in another parallel universe, and it was a really great place to be a lot of the time. So, yes, I believe he achieved his aim. It's a pity he didn't flourish like he wanted it to. But for those who were there, it was for real.
What's going to happen to this idea that you've realised here?
It's in the hands of the gods. Those whom the gods love die young. Perhaps they will turn their head against it, I'm not sure.
Bonanza, well, that's how it goes. Our parents' world was fading fast.